Walk through any supermarket aisle and you will see shelves full of tinned mushrooms. They look harmless, they look convenient, and most people assume they are all basically the same. But once you start opening these cans, the differences become hard to ignore. Mushrooms that collapse the moment they hit the pan, mushrooms that release more water than flavour, and some tins that rely heavily on the label to sound better than they actually are. The problem is not always dangerous ingredients. The problem is something quieter, poor quality, hiding behind convenience. Today, we are counting down 9 UK tinned mushroom brands that often fall short once you actually use them. Let's begin with number 9. Number 9. Essential Waitrose chopped mushrooms in water. This is the kind of product that looks more impressive than it really is. The label feels tidy, the name feels respectable. The store itself gives it a slightly better image before you even pick it up. And because of that, a lot of people assume the can must be a step above the usual budget options. But once you strip that feeling away, what you are left with is a can of chopped mushrooms in water, and that already tells you a lot. The mushrooms are chopped before they even get to you, which means one of the main things that makes mushrooms enjoyable is already fading before the meal even begins. That matters because mushrooms are not the kind of food that can afford to lose much texture. They are not like peas, where softness is expected. They are not like beans, where the inside still has some body even after being canned. Mushrooms rely on bite. They need a little chew. They need that savory feel that makes them satisfying in a fry-up, a stew, or a sauce. Once they are chopped, packed in water, and sitting on a shelf, they start moving away from that. Instead of bringing character to the meal, they often end up sinking into it. And that is where this one becomes disappointing. If it were clearly a very cheap, very basic tin, some people might shrug and accept it. But this product asks you to think of it as something a little better. That is the trap. It is not a terrible product in a dramatic way. It's just one of those tins that quietly under-delivers while still looking like it belongs in a better category. You open it expecting something a little more useful, a little more solid, a little more worth the shelf space, and instead you get a soft filler that doesn't do much once the heat goes on. What makes it more frustrating is that chopped mushrooms are already doing half the work for the manufacturer, not for you. You are not paying for a product with real presence. You are paying for something broken down, softened, and made easier to store. For a food like mushrooms, that's not a small loss. It changes the entire eating experience. And once you notice how much texture disappears in a premium-looking tin like this, it becomes much harder to trust the next can just because the front sounds a bit more generous.
Number 8. Sainsbury's whole button mushrooms in water. Whole button mushrooms sound better straight away. They sound fuller. They sound firmer. They sound as though they might hold up properly in a pan and still feel close to the fresh version. That is exactly why products like this keep getting picked up by sensible shoppers who think they are making the better choice. The wording suggests less handling, less breakdown, and a more satisfying result. But that is the trick with canned mushrooms. Whole on the label can make people imagine something much closer to real food than what actually comes out of the tin. Once opened, products like this can still be disappointingly soft. The shape may still be there, at least at first glance, but the eating quality often is not. They can feel wet, they can feel tired, they can feel as though they have already given up before you even start cooking with them. That is a problem because whole mushrooms create a stronger expectation. People assume they will be sturdier in a casserole, richer in a sauce, or more satisfying in a cooked breakfast. But once the texture drops away, that hope fades very quickly. This is why this one lands so high on the list. It is not that the tin is doing anything especially strange or shocking. It is that the product uses a stronger sounding description to sell a result that still often feels weak. Mushrooms should bring a little life to a meal. They should add savory depth and some substance. Tinned whole mushrooms often promise that on the front and then fail to provide it in the pan. They can shrink in presence the moment the heat hits them. They can release more liquid than you want. They can leave you wishing you had simply bought fresh mushrooms and sliced them yourself.
And that is really the issue with so many of these tins. They ask you to lower your standards a little without saying so directly. They turn convenience into the main event and hope you do not mind what gets lost in the process. With this one, the word whole does a lot of work, but the actual mushrooms often do not. And when a product leans that heavily on the label, it makes the next basic tin even more revealing, because the next one does not even try to sound special. We dig through supermarket products so you don't have to, so subscribe for more insights.
Number 7. Tesco sliced mushrooms. This is one of those plain everyday cans that slips into shopping baskets without much thought. It does not shout for attention, it does not try to sound fancy. It just sits there looking practical, almost invisible, which is why so many people assume it must be harmless enough. Just sliced mushrooms in a can, simple, useful, cheap enough to keep on hand. That is how a lot of shoppers see it. But this kind of product can quietly lower your expectations without you noticing. Once mushrooms are sliced, packed in liquid and left sitting on a shelf, they are already a long way from what makes them worth eating. Fresh mushrooms bring more than flavor. They bring shape, bite, and that slightly savory texture that gives a dish some backbone. Tinned sliced mushrooms often give you much less of that. They can come out limp, they can feel thin, they can slide straight into a soup or sauce and vanish without adding much beyond the idea of mushrooms being there. That is the part many people miss. The real weakness of products like this is not some dramatic ingredient or headline-grabbing problem, it's the quiet disappointment. You open the can thinking it will help build a better meal, but what comes out is often a soft, watery version of something that should have had more presence. It fills space, it makes the dish look more complete, but in terms of taste and texture, it often does far less than you hoped. And when that becomes the pattern, the whole question changes. It stops being about whether the tin is safe or simple and starts becoming something more practical. Why buy mushrooms at all if the version you're getting barely behaves like mushrooms once cooked? That is where products like this start to feel like habit purchases rather than smart ones. You buy them because they seem useful, not because they actually deliver much. And that thought gets even stronger with the next entry, because the next one looks even cleaner on paper and still ends up feeling like a weak trade. Number 6. Morrison's sliced mushrooms in water. There is something about a plain-looking can that makes people trust it more. If the label is straightforward and the ingredients sound simple, many shoppers take that as a sign that the product must be honest. And to be fair, that is part of the appeal here. There is no big story on the front, no attempt to sound luxurious, just sliced mushrooms in water. On the surface, it feels like one of the more sensible options in the aisle. But plain is not the same as worthwhile. That is what tins like this show so clearly. Mushrooms are one of those foods that do not gain much from being packed this way. Once they're sliced, soaked and stored, they lose too much of what gives them value in a meal. They can turn limp very quickly. They can release even more water once they hit the pan, and instead of deepening the dish, they can weaken it by bringing extra moisture without much real reward in return. That is why this kind of can be so deceptive. On paper, it looks fine. It looks like the kind of thing you should keep in the cupboard for convenience. But when you actually use it, the product often feels less like a helpful ingredient and more like something that is merely there. It fills out the recipe, it gives the appearance of mushrooms, but flavor-wise and texture-wise, it can fall short in a way that makes the whole meal feel flatter. For older viewers especially, that matters. Value is not just about the lowest price or the simplest label. Value is about whether the food actually helps you make something you want to eat. If you open a can and what comes out is soft, wet and lacking in bite, then the convenience only gets you so far. At some point, you have to ask whether the shortcut was worth taking in the first place. And when even the simplest tins struggle to answer that, the next product becomes even more revealing, because once again, it tries to win you over with the word whole.
Number 5. Asda whole button mushrooms in water. This is another product that sounds much better than it usually turns out. Whole button mushrooms, nice and clear. It gives off the feeling of something a little closer to fresh, a little more solid, a little more useful in proper cooking. It sounds as though you are getting mushrooms with some shape, some body, and some ability to hold up in the pan. That is the image. That is why people pick it up. But canned mushrooms have a way of making that image feel much bigger than the result. Once opened, the same old problems start showing up again. The mushrooms may still look whole, but they often do not feel whole when you eat them. The texture softens too easily. The pieces can feel damp rather than meaty. And because mushrooms rely on texture so heavily, that loss matters more than people realize. This is what makes products like this disappointing rather than dramatic. They are not terrible enough to shock you, they are just not good enough to make you glad you bought them. They can do a job in a quick pie filling or a stew when you have nothing else around, but the result still often feels second best from the first bite. There is a flatness to the experience that fresh mushrooms rarely have. Even frozen mushrooms can sometimes make more sense than a tin that has already done so much damage to the texture. The problem is not only that the product falls short, it is that it does so while sounding like it should have been the safer bet. Whole button mushrooms sounds reassuring. It sounds like a product for people who do not want to compromise too much. But once cooked, the compromise becomes obvious. And if you think the answer is to go cheaper and simply expect less, that can be an even bigger mistake. Because the next entry shows what happens when mushrooms drop into the budget lane and start being sold almost like an afterthought. Number 4. Just Essentials by Asda Sliced Mushrooms. This is the budget option that many people will defend straight away, and I understand why. It is cheap, it is basic, it is easy to keep in the cupboard. If you are watching your spending carefully, it can feel like one of those sensible things to have on hand for soups, stews, and whatever else you need to throw together in a hurry. On the surface, it sounds practical. That is exactly how these tins win people over. But mushrooms are one of the worst foods to cheap out on in this format. When the product is already in a weak position because it has been sliced, soaked, and shelf-stored, going for the very cheapest option usually means lowering the payoff even more. You are no longer buying mushrooms because they are truly satisfying or delicious. You are buying them because the can is there, because the price is low, and because it feels like something useful must be inside. Too often, what comes out is soft, pale, and barely noticeable once it is heated through. They can disappear into gravy, they can vanish into soup, they can sit in the pan and never really become the rich, savory ingredient people imagine when they think of mushrooms. That is the key problem. Cheap is only good value if the food still improves the meal. If the product barely leaves an impression once cooked, then the money saved at the till can be a false comfort. For a lot of older shoppers, this is exactly how habits form. You buy the budget tin because it seems sensible, you use it because it is there, and over time, you stop asking whether you actually enjoy it. It becomes part of the routine, not because it is good, but because it is familiar and cheap enough not to question. That is where poor value hides, not in a shocking price, but in a product that quietly trains you to expect less from your meals. And even a familiar old brand cannot always fix that problem, which is why the next one is so revealing. Number 3. Bachelor's Sliced Mushrooms in Water. This is where brand recognition comes into the picture. A lot of people trust a name they have seen for years. It feels safer. It feels more reliable. It feels like if you go with the known brand, the product inside has to be a little better than the supermarket own label version sitting next to it. That kind of trust is powerful, especially with pantry staples. People assume that history must count for something. But with tinned mushrooms, the gap between branded and own brand is often much smaller than people think. This is still a can of sliced mushrooms in water. It still faces the same basic weaknesses as the others. It still trades freshness for shelf life. It still softens the texture. It still leans heavily on convenience rather than true eating quality. That is what makes it such a letdown. The familiar name can make shoppers expect more, but once the can is opened, that extra trust has to become a better result on the plate, and that is exactly where products like this often come up short. A known brand cannot put bite back into softened mushrooms. It cannot restore freshness after months on a shelf. It cannot turn a weak format into a strong purchase just by having a label people remember. That is why this one belongs so high on the list. It is not simply about what's in the can, it's about the quiet gap between what the brand name encourages you to expect and what the product actually gives you. In some ways, that can be more disappointing than a poor own-label tin, because a branded product should have been the one to justify itself more clearly. Instead, it often ends up feeling very close to the same compromise in a slightly more trusted wrapper, and that makes the runner-up even more important, because this next tin is as plain as they come, and its plainness reveals something bigger about the whole category.
Number 2. Co-op sliced mushrooms in water. There is nothing dramatic about this can, and that is exactly what makes it so useful for this list. No fancy wording, no promise of richer flavour, no attempt to sound premium or special, just sliced mushrooms in water, sitting there as if that alone should be enough to convince you. And for many shoppers, it is enough. A plain can often feels honest. It feels as though the supermarket is not trying to dress the product up as something it is not. But by this stage in the countdown, the pattern should be clear. Even when the label is this simple, canned mushrooms still struggle to justify themselves. Because the real problem is not always branding or added ingredients. Sometimes the problem is the format itself. Mushrooms lose too much when they are sliced, soaked and stored in a can. They lose their savoury edge, they lose their bite, they lose the little bit of firmness that makes them feel like proper food rather than an afterthought in the pan. That is what makes this one a runner-up. It proves that even when almost everything about the label looks honest and unremarkable, the final product can still be a poor trade. It may be easy to store, it may be easy to throw into a meal, but easy is not always enough. If the result is dull, soft and barely memorable, then the simplicity of the can does not rescue it. In fact, it makes the weakness of the category even harder to ignore. And that is why the number 1 spot goes to the can that moves even further away from the idea of simple mushrooms. The others mostly disappoint by being watery and forgettable. The final one takes a different route and ends up at the top for that very reason. Number 1. Cook's & Company Seasoned Sliced Mushrooms. This one stands out immediately because it is not pretending to be a plain cupboard staple. It's trying to feel richer, readier and more special. Seasoned sliced mushrooms, ready to serve, hot or cold. That sounds convenient. It sounds like the kind of product that might save time and still bring a bit more flavour to the table. But once you look closer, that extra flavour starts to feel less like a benefit and more like a cover. Because this is where a simple vegetable gets pushed much further into processed food territory. Instead of just mushrooms and water, you're now dealing with mushrooms packed with a heavy amount of oil and extra flavouring. That changes the entire nature of the product. It is no longer just a weak version of mushrooms in a tin, it's a dressed-up can built to feel richer than it really is. And that should make you stop for a moment. If you want mushrooms, why buy a can that needs so much help to seem appealing? That is the question this product raises better than any other on the list. The added oil, the seasonings, the ready-to-serve idea, all of it suggests a product doing a lot of work to make up for what canned mushrooms often lack naturally. It's trying to feel convenient, tasty and impressive all at once, but in doing that it moves even further away from the simple ingredient most people think they're buying. So the next time you see a tin of mushrooms sitting quietly on the supermarket shelf, you might look at it a little differently. Some cans are just weak shortcuts that never quite deliver the flavour or texture people expect, but that's just my breakdown. Now I want to hear yours. Which tinned mushroom brand have you tried, and did any of them actually surprise you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy these kinds of honest supermarket breakdowns, please like the video and subscribe, because we're constantly digging into the everyday products that shoppers buy without realizing what they are actually getting.